on my personal video as much as I can, and then I will try to upload my video to the YouTube. All right, so I have to be pretty quick today. Hopefully I'll be able to catch everything. So what is the goal of Satanism? The goal of Satanism is to satisfy all your worldly lusts. How does it look like Christianity? It's just the opposite of Christianity. They believe in the same important figures. They believe in God. They believe in Satan. They believe in Jesus. It's just that they have flipped it. Satan is the only one they want to follow, and God is the one they want to defeat. But they would both agree that the world is in a constant battle between good and evil. Christians have just chosen the good side. How is it different from Christianity? Again, it's the opposite. Christians don't believe Satan is good. They don't believe that he will win in the end. They do believe that he is powerful, which is why they're so serious about Satanism. They believe it is a real religion and a dangerous one at that. So, their God is Satan. Their main figurehead is Anton LaVey, actor and author, and Michael Aquino, the high priest of the Temple of Set. I do believe recently, I think that that Alice Cooper became the high priest. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to check it. But I think that the new high priest is Alice Cooper. Afterlife, heaven. They think that Satan will conquer heaven. This is the exact opposite of what the scriptures teach. Worldview is monotheistic and occultic. The sacred text is the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, as they read other books about spells and rituals. Their worship services are held in a temple and sometimes in outdoors wooded areas. Rituals, rites, and sacraments. Some of these are really gross. Animal sacrifice, human sacrifice by murder or suicide, sex clubs, where they have any kind of sex or fetish you can think of, drugs, doing whatever you want, divination, communicating with the demonic, casting spells and hexes to get what you want. In the movies, when the devil character is a beautiful woman, for example, like in the movie Bedazzled, notice that the devil is not always portrayed as a slimy, fire-breathing creature. Geographic center is in the United States. Number of followers, known followers at the time of this printing, is 20,000 in the USA. But of course, we know that there are probably in the millions because there are lots of high-level and high-ranking people that practice Satanism. Important vocabulary: hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure above everything else. Examples of belief in pop culture: Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary gets pregnant by the devil and has a horror child. Again, it's the opposite of Christianity. Celebrities that are known Satanists: Mick Jagger, legendary Rolling Stone. He declined the role of Satan in a movie called Lucifer Rising. Sammy Davis Jr. at one point was a Satanist, but I think he converted to Judaism later in his life. Jane Mansfield, the actor. The trick. The trick here is that there isn't a trick. Satanism is real. All the stuff they believe in exists in a real way, except it's very evil. Satanists do hate God. They have sold their soul to the devil. They are partners with the father of lies. Their whole lives are ruled by lies. It's no wonder that Satanism has always been associated with suicide, an indication that they're not having a great time, despite the fact that they're constantly seeking pleasure. So, those are all the official kind of basic groundwork of Satanism. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about growing up with a stepfather. My earliest memory of him was 2 years old. So from 2 to 11 years old, I grew up with a man who practiced Satanism. He was a 33rd degree Mason. So, yeah. He was a 33rd degree Mason. He practiced Satanism. And I do know that in Masonry, you can worship any god in Masonry. But in particular, he chose to worship Satan. So, That's one thing that I do know. He was a 33rd degree Mason. And he was very, very, very high up in the area that we lived in growing up, which was in Florida. So what I did is I kind of put up here about 6 points I want to talk about, because I'm not going to talk about all this publicly. Again, I want to be respectful of other people's privacy. So I want to just kind of talk in different points about what it was like growing up with a Satanist. So from 2 to 11, he was a part of my family. At first, he was not my stepfather. He and my mother lived together for the first 7 years of my life, and then they decided to get married. The first 7 years of my life, we lived in the hood, and I just remember it being very, very, very chaotic. Many times it was tumultuous. My family at the time, because it was my siblings and I, 2 of my siblings and I, and then his son and his daughter, we were all living together at one point, and we were always in some kind of trouble. We were always in some kind of trouble. Either we got into like neighborhood fights. Somebody was always like trying to fight our entire family. His son and I got into a lot of trouble as kids. He was kind of like, we were both the same age. And so he would just, he was doing some wild stuff. And I would go along with him because, if my mom said, hey, go outside, I want you guys to play together, etc. So we were kind of like partners in crime. And, he would he would utilize me to help do certain things. And I remember my mother and his father having a falling out about it. And I remember the beating that my mother took for trying to correct his son. And after that, his son was sent away. So after that, I didn't really have much contact with his son anymore after that point, because my mother was basically like, I can't do anything with your son because you refuse to let me correct him or discipline him. So at this point, they were still not married. My earliest, I would say, memory of that time, the first 7 years, I was about 4 years old. And I remember being the child that had heightened spiritual senses. At the time, I didn't know that, it was dealing with the prophetic or any of that. I was just terrified. And I remember there would be several nights where my family would be asleep, and I would sit up in bed and I would be wide awake, and I would see spiritual things, spiritual beings. And I remember as a child, I'd sit up and then I'd be rubbing my eyes, and I'd be blinking, like making sure, like, am I really seeing this? And I would scream. I would start crying and I would start screaming, and I would wake up the whole house. And my mom would come into my room and she would say, what is going on? Why are you waking up the whole house? Why are you, screaming to the top of your lungs? And I would say, I see something evil, and it's walking through the house. And my mom, of course, she was like, girl, if you do not go back to bed, I know something. So I remember having several times in my childhood, around 4 years old, when I just stopped talking about what I saw. And one particular time, after my mom would go back to bed, then I noticed that he would get up and he would start walking the hallways. And so one of the things that I recognized from that later is that he was actually summoning evil spirits. And a part of what he did was he summons these spirits almost as a lure. One particular time, there was a hand that actually came to my door. And if you've ever been in a house at night where your lights are maybe off, but your hallway is lit up, so you can you have light in your hallway. I remember seeing this particular spirit. It actually came to the door, and it actually started summoning me to come to it, but I refused. And so that was one of like my earliest recollections of him being tied to the spirit world. I came to find out later that the place where we were living was actually built on top of a cemetery, where they had just basically covered over the cemetery and built a new set of housing. And so people that deal in the occult, in the spirit realm, they like to be close to cemeteries. They like to be close to places that have a spiritual portal. All right. So that was one of the things that I knew about him from an early age, that he was involved in something demonic, in something that had to do with the spirit world. As I got older, I noticed that there was really no books in our house except for one book that he kept out and he left out all the time. And of course, later I figured out this was part of his spiritual practice, because he would have this book out, and then he would, when we would come into a room or whatever, he would close the book and then set it aside. And so I remembered what that book was, because it was the only book that I saw that was around that belonged to him. And that book was L. Ron Hubbard, Dianetics. So he probably practiced a form of witchcraft and Scientology mixed together. That was the only book that I saw that he had out. In my home, most of you already know, because I talked about it before, I was not raised in a Christian home. My mom was raised as a believer, but she had decided to denounce Christ, forsake Christ, and she had decided that she was not going to raise her children in any kind of Christian faith or belief. So he was, as far as spirituality went, he was as far as what we saw growing up. All right. And there was no Bible in my home. This was the only book that I remember being in the house, and that was L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics. Other memories that I have of him. One of the memories that I have of him, after we moved, when I turned 9, we moved to a middle class neighborhood. We were leaving the hood. We were like, thank God, we're moving to, as the Jefferson said, we're moving on up. So we moved to the middle class, black middle class in South Florida. If I said the name of the neighborhood, most people who live in South Florida would know the neighborhood we moved into. But at this point, he and my mother got married, and he was still a very kind of like enigma of a person, so you really didn't know him. But we were kind of happy that, okay, at least, he and my mom are getting married. Around this time, when we moved to the new place in the middle class neighborhood, I started noticing that he was giving more attention to one of my relatives than was normal. All right. I didn't understand everything about it, but I knew that something wasn't right about the amount of attention that he was giving to this relative. Once we moved, he would do things in front of us that we knew were like not normal or supernatural. So one of the things that I remember just growing up in that particular time, we would be at the dinner table and we'd be sitting down to eat. And I remember him looking at objects on the table, and rather than like asking for it and say, hey, can you pass me this or can you pass me that, he would actually look at the object and the object would come towards him. So we saw him doing these things. It was something that I didn't realize was like demonic because he did it in, he did it in front of us. But he would bring things close to him at dinner, just, with the power of his mind. There was another time when we were driving. I don't remember where we were driving, but anyway, he was stopped by the police. And I remember I was very scared at the time that something was going to go wrong. And I remember us being stopped, and I was sitting in the front passenger seat, so I knew that maybe he might have gotten in trouble for that. So the officer came over, and when the officer came over, he came over from the passenger side, and he looked into the window at my stepfather. Well, I was looking at my stepfather as the officer was looking at him, and the officer said, can I have your ID? And when the officer said that, my stepfather looked at him, and his eyes began to change colors. His eyes actually looked literally like a red ball of fire. And the officer looked at him and he said, "You're free to go." And that was the end of that. The officer walked off, and he started up his car, and no further words were exchanged or said. And so, again, I was kind of getting a clue that something was weird and different about this man that we were now living with. So those are some of the examples of things that he did in front of us that, as a young person at the time, I didn't understand the ramifications of what he was doing and what he was displaying. The fourth thing I want to talk about is the fact that he actually practiced ritual worship and ritual child sexual abuse. I won't go into all the details, but I will tell you that at one point he took me and my relative to a wooded, secluded area, and he took that relative out, and they went into the woods. And from where I was sitting in the vehicle, I could not see exactly what he was doing, but I know he was performing some kind of ritual. And then he came back to the vehicle and he asked me, did I want done to myself what my relative had done to them? And I remember just saying no. I didn't know what it was. He didn't give me any details, but I just said no. And one thing I learned from that is that the enemy cannot really do anything without your permission. He has to have your permission. So whatever ritualistic thing he did in the woods, he brought that relative back to the vehicle, and then we went back to our home from there. It would be later that I would actually walk in on him performing child sexual abuse. And again, I won't go into that. It wound up turning into a huge case. I was not allowed to testify during that case. The relative that he performed the sexual abuse on was so scared because at one point before the trial was set, he was actually stalking our family. He was threatening our family. And that relative became so terrified that he was going to kill us all that they chose not to testify. So he actually, during that trial, she chose not to testify, but his daughter, who had been living with us earlier, did testify because she was older, and she testified of an incestuous relationship that he had with her. And it also turned out that he was a bigamist, because he was actually not legally married to my mother. He was actually married to another woman that he had married when she was 13. So he had all kind of stuff going on. Child bride stuff, incest with his own daughter, child sexual abuse with my relative. So, yeah, not stuff I want to talk about. I do remember during that time, when he was finally exposed for the evil, because I caught him doing it, I remember him being very, very terrified. And I remember him saying to me, don't tell, don't tell your mother, etc. And I don't know where I got this boldness from, because I think back to that time and I say, wow, he could have just, like some of these cases we see today, he could have just killed us all. But I basically stood up to him and I said, no, I'm going to tell. And so from that point, he got his things, got out of there, ran to another city. So we actually wound up having the trial in another city in Florida, not in South Florida. But I said that to say that sometimes even as a child, you don't know the extent of the God that you have in you, but the enemy knows. And so I just found that to be very interesting looking back, that he was afraid, so afraid that he was going to be exposed, that he literally wound up packing up as much things as he could and running away and escaping town. And so they had to arrest him in another town, and that town was the town that held his trial. What else do I want to say? Apparently he had violated some kind of rules within the occult or whatever, because the people in our community, that once they found out what he had done, the people in the occult world basically said that if he returned to the city, that they would have him executed. So yeah, there was that. And what else? After he left, because we were living in this new middle-class neighborhood, after he left and left my mother basically with the trauma of what happened and bills that she could not afford to pay on her one income, we actually wound up being evicted from our home, and we wound up homeless for about 4 months. So yeah, all of that was happening at the same time. So while we were homeless, he was stalking us, in between us trying to find a place to stay and trying to get to school, all at the same time while we were homeless, and threatening my relative that, if they testified against him, that he was going to have us all killed. So that's why she chose not to testify. So when people look at victims of child sexual abuse and we say, why didn't they say anything, or why did they wait so long to say anything, those are some reasons behind why they wait so long. Sometimes they're being threatened. Sometimes their families are being threatened. And so I think that was a brave choice that my relative made, because we knew how evil this person was, and they were probably capable of carrying out their threat. All right. The other thing I remember about him before the whole exposure happened with the ritual child abuse and the ritual child sexual abuse is that he was in wars with other warlocks, and he used concoctions to actually be free from whatever evil spells or whatever evil spirits they placed upon him. Again, I won't go into detail as to how I know that, but I did see the results of him using certain concoctions to be rid of certain evil spirits. And lastly, we almost died at one point because of he would have these rituals where he would burn candles throughout the house, kind of like what witchcraft candles, people would get these candles that'll say burn this if you want prosperity or whatever. And anyway, he would have these candles burning throughout the house. This one particular time, he left the candles burning in his bedroom, and we did not know that he had these candles going. Apparently, somehow or another, the candle fell down on his nightstand And on his nightstand, he had all of these like men's perfumes and men's colognes. And we were inside the home, and I smelt something burning. And so I went back. We generally were not allowed, in their bedroom. But I went back to the bedroom because that's where I smelt the smoke coming from. And then I opened the door, and I saw that the top of his nightstand was on fire. So then I went to my other relatives, and I was like, I ran out of there screaming, saying, hey, this thing is on fire. Let's try to put it out. So we started filling up pots of water, and we were running back and forth trying to put the fire out, but the fire was not going out. And so finally, I just felt the inclination to just tell my relatives to, let's just get out of here. Let's leave the house. And then we ran to our neighbors across the street to call the fire department, because obviously we realized the fire wasn't going out. As soon as we ran out of the house and we made it to the other side of the street, there was an explosion. The entire bedroom exploded, wall included. And so, yeah, by the time the fire department got there, that whole side of the house where the bedroom was, the whole side had been blown out, and it was up in flames. And we were just standing across the street like, oh boy, this is, yeah, we could have almost died. And then when the fire department came and they finished, putting out the fire, they basically said, yeah, we're glad that you ran out of the house, because had you not run out of the house, you probably would be dead too. Because it was a chemical fire. And of course, as young kids, we just think, hey, fire, throw some water on it and it'll stop. But that was why the fire was not going out, because it was a chemical fire and they needed to put actual stuff on it. For those of you who are firefighters watching, they actually needed to put something on it to actually contain it, because it was not a regular fire. It was a chemical fire. So those are just a few things about living with a practicing Satanist. So, because of some of the things that I saw him doing, and because of some of the rituals that I saw him doing, thank you, Pastor Ben, the foam to smother it. Because of some of the things that I saw him doing, because of the way I saw him living, I'm kind of sensitive to the demonic and the occult world in operation in church. And so when I see people who say that they're servants of God, and when I see them operate in certain ways that is similar to the occult, I'm always wary of those kinds of people. When I see spiritual leaders with Masonic rings on their fingers, I'm going to always think something is not right. Okay? That's just me. Because having grown up with that level of satanic operation and the occult, I can recognize it when I see it in people who say that they're worshiping Christ. So, that's all I'll say about that. And I hope that I have said something today that would give you a little bit of insight into that world. I did get a chance to talk to his son, the one who was sent away a couple years ago. Someone actually got me in touch with him. I was actually able to talk to him by phone. And because his father never stood trial, his father actually wound up staying in the same city where he had the trial, and he was they basically said they didn't have enough evidence to convict him. Even his older daughter's testimony was not enough evidence to convict him. But I think they did charge him with bigamy, and he wound up staying in that same city where he had been charged. The son actually wound up committing some crime, and he spent 10 years in prison. And he was out, and I was having a conversation with him, and I asked him, I said, did your father ever repent? You know, did your father ever repent for the things that he did? And he basically was like, I don't know. But he did tell me that he was pronounced with terminal cancer. So the last thing I heard was that he was dealing with terminal cancer, but I haven't heard anything else about him. And to be honest with you, I just pray that he repents. I don't necessarily harbor any ill will towards him or any ill feelings. I just pray that he repents, because if he does not, hell awaits. And so that's all I have to say about that. So anybody have any questions for me? Those of you who are in the chat box, this is your opportunity to ask me some questions. I have thought about a couple of times writing my story, but I don't know if I could, because again, the other people involved who grew up with him and who actually experienced the sexual abuse have chosen not to talk about it. So because my story is connected to theirs, there's certain things I cannot say or mention. All right. So anybody